Call your supervisor, she said softly. And make sure you use code 714. The click of metal echoed sharper than it should have inside the quiet pharmacy. A small, ordinary sound that somehow carried across every aisle, every shelf of neatly stacked prescriptions and over-the-counter bottles, cutting through the low hum of fluorescent lights and murmured conversations as Officer Ryan Keller tightened his grip just enough to make a point, not enough to raise suspicion, because in his mind this wasn't unusual. This was routine, this was control, and control was something he had learned to wear as comfortably as the badge pinned to his chest, polished, visible, unquestioned. While in front of him stood Margaret Johnson, a frail-looking elderly woman with silver hair pulled neatly back, her cardigan slightly oversized, her hands steady despite the situation, her eyes calm in a way that didn't quite match the scene unfolding around her, as if she were observing rather than reacting, as if this moment belonged to someone else, and that alone should have been enough to make him pause. But it didn't, because people like Ryan Keller didn't pause, not when they believed they were right, not when years of quiet reinforcement had taught them that suspicion was instinct and instinct was truth. So when the pharmacy clerk pointed and whispered, when the word fraud floated just loud enough to justify action, he stepped forward without hesitation, his voice firm, controlled, carrying just enough authority to make the room fall silent. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." And when she didn't immediately move, when she simply looked at him with that same unreadable calm, something in him tightened, not fear, not doubt, just irritation, the kind that builds when expectations aren't met, when the script doesn't play out the way it always has. And that's when he reached for her wrist, not roughly, not dramatically, just enough to assert the outcome he had already decided. Because to him this wasn't a question, it was a conclusion, and around them, people began to watch, some pretending not to, others openly staring, phones subtly angled, capturing fragments of a moment that still felt small, still felt contained, like something that would pass and be forgotten. But the air had already shifted, the kind of shift you can't quite name but you can feel, like a storm forming somewhere, just out of sight. And Margaret noticed it, not in the people, not in the whispers, but in him, in the way his confidence leaned just slightly too far into certainty, in the way he spoke without listening, in the way he never once asked the question that could have changed everything. And still, she didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, because she didn't need to. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't to stop what's happening, but to let it unfold just long enough for the truth to arrive on its own. And so as he secured the cuffs and turned her slightly toward the exit, already moving on to the next step in a process he believed he controlled, she spoke, her voice low, steady, almost gentle. "Call your supervisor, and make sure you use code 714. And for the first time, not fully, not consciously, but just enough to matter, something in Officer Keller hesitated, a fraction of a second, a flicker, because that wasn't part of the script, and somewhere between the silence that followed and the faint crackle of his radio coming to life, the moment stopped being routine, even if he didn't realize it yet. The radio on Officer Ryan Keller's shoulder crackled with a sharp burst of static, the kind that usually meant nothing more than routine chatter, background noise in a job built on repetition. But this time the sound lingered just a second too long, stretching into the silence that had settled over the pharmacy, and for reasons he could not immediately explain, he did not speak right away, his thumb hovering over the button as if waiting for the moment to pass, as if ignoring it might restore the normal rhythm of control he was used to. But it did not, because Margaret Johnson remained exactly as she was, still, composed, her gaze steady without challenge, without fear, and that steadiness pressed against him in a way that felt unfamiliar, like standing in a room where everyone else knew something you did not. And then the voice came through, calm but alert. "Unit 12, confirm status," and he cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly, reasserting himself with a tone that sounded more confident than he felt. "This is Keller. I have a suspect in custody, possible prescription fraud." The words came easily, practiced, shaped by years of saying them without question, and for a brief second that seemed to anchor him again, until the dispatcher responded, "Copy that. Do you require supervisor notification?" And there it was, the opening, the choice, the exact point where the situation could have remained small, contained, forgettable, but Margaret's voice returned, just as calm, just as precise. Use code 714. She did not raise it, did not repeat it. She simply said it as if it belonged there, as if it had always been part of the process, and Keller hesitated again. This time just long enough for the hesitation to become visible, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced at her, searching for something. Anything that would explain why those words felt heavier than they should. Because code 714 was not something civilians knew. It was not something you overheard or guessed. It was internal, specific, and rarely used. And suddenly the room felt smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher, the quiet more deliberate, like every person watching had leaned in just enough to sense the shift without understanding it. And against his better judgment, against the instinct that told him to ignore it and proceed, he pressed the button, dispatch, notify supervisor, code 714. The words sounded different coming out of his mouth, slower, more deliberate, and the response was not immediate, just a pause, a long, stretching pause that seemed to pull the air out of the room before the voice returned, no longer casual, no longer routine. Unit 12, confirmed that code. And now it was unmistakable. Something had changed, not in Margaret, not in the crowd, but in the system itself, like a switch had been flipped somewhere beyond his reach, and Keller felt it before he understood it. A subtle tightening in his chest, a flicker of doubt that he quickly tried to suppress. Confirmed, he said, firmer this time, as if strength in his voice could restore the balance, but it did not. Because the next response came faster, sharper. Hold position, supervisor en route. Do not proceed further. And those last 4 words landed harder than anything else, not because they were loud, but because they were final. And for the first time since he had stepped into that pharmacy, Officer Ryan Keller was no longer the one deciding what happened next, and he knew it. The air did not move. After that, not in the way it should have, not in the casual rhythm of a place where people came and went without thinking, because now every second felt stretched, held in place by something unseen, something heavier than the situation itself, and Officer Ryan Keller could feel it settling in, not as panic, not yet, but as a slow, creeping awareness that the ground beneath his authority was no longer solid. And he adjusted his stance slightly, tightening his jaw as if posture alone could restore the certainty he had lost. While across from him Margaret Johnson remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, her silence no longer passive but deliberate, and that silence spoke louder now than any protest ever could, because it forced everyone else to fill the space with their own thoughts, their own questions, their own doubt. And around them the pharmacy had shifted from a place of routine to a stage of quiet observation. The clerk, who had made the initial accusation, now standing behind the counter with hands clasped too tightly, eyes flicking between Keller and Margaret, as if trying to understand how something so simple had become so complicated, while a man near the aisle lowered his phone just slightly, not because he lost interest, but because he realized he was witnessing something he did not fully understand, something that was no longer just about a misunderstanding, but about a mistake that had already been made and could not be undone. And Keller felt that too, even if he refused to name it, even if he told himself this was still under control, that supervisors got called all the time, that procedures were meant to support him, not question him. But the words from dispatch echoed in his mind. Do not proceed further, not assist, not continue, but stop. And stopping was not something he was used to doing, especially not in front of a crowd, especially not when he had already taken action. And he glanced down briefly at the cuffs, then back at Margaret, as if expecting her to say something else, something that would explain everything in a way that made sense to him. But she did not. She simply stood there, breathing evenly, waiting, as if time itself were on her side. And that was the part that unsettled him most, because people who had nothing to hide did not wait like that. They argued, they defended themselves, they demanded answers. But she did none of those things. She waited. And in that waiting there was a quiet certainty that made his own feel suddenly fragile. And then the sound came. Distant at first, the low hum of an approaching vehicle, not fast, not urgent, but deliberate, and it grew just enough to be noticed, just enough to draw a few heads toward the glass doors at the front of the pharmacy, where the reflection of flashing lights began to flicker faintly against the windows, not chaotic, not overwhelming, just present, like a signal that something official had arrived. And Keller felt his chest tighten slightly as he followed their gaze, his mind already working through explanations, through justifications, through the sequence of events he would present, because that was how this worked. He acted, others reviewed, and it always aligned in the end. It always had, but as the vehicle came to a stop and the engine cut, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier than before, a thought crossed his mind that he could not immediately dismiss. A question that had not existed 5 minutes ago. What if this time it does not? And he pushed it aside, straightening his shoulders, preparing to reassert control the moment the door opened. But before that could happen, before the next step could unfold, Margaret spoke again, not loudly, not urgently, just enough for him to hear. It is already done. And for the first time, Officer Ryan Keller realized that whatever was about to happen next was not something he could control, because it had already been set in motion long before he ever stepped into that pharmacy. The door opened with a soft chime that sounded far too ordinary for what followed. A simple electronic tone that usually meant a customer walking in or out. But this time it carried weight, drawing every eye in the room toward the entrance as a tall man in a dark jacket stepped inside with a pace that was calm, yet unmistakably purposeful, not rushed, not hesitant, just direct. And behind him the fading reflection of red and blue lights flickered against the glass before disappearing as the door closed again, sealing the moment inside. And Officer Ryan Keller straightened instinctively, shoulders pulling back, chin lifting slightly as he prepared to take control of the narrative the way he always had, because this was still his scene, still his call, and whatever had been triggered by that code would be clarified, contained, resolved. But the man did not look at him first, did not acknowledge him in the way supervisors usually did when stepping into a situation. Instead, his attention went straight to Margaret Johnson, his expression shifting in a way that was subtle yet unmistakable. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that changes everything without a single word being spoken. And then he stopped a few feet away from her, his posture straight but his tone measured. "Ma'am," he said quietly. And that one word carried more weight than anything that had been said in the last 5 minutes, because it was not procedural, it was respectful, intentional, and it landed in the room like a signal that the balance had already shifted, and Keller felt it immediately. A tightening in his chest that he could not ignore this time, because this was not how these interactions usually began, not when he was the one in charge, not when he had already taken action, and he stepped forward slightly, inserting himself back into the center, his voice firm but edged now with something less certain. "Supervisor, I have the situation under control. Suspected prescription fraud." The subject refused to cooperate. The words came out in the same order he had used countless times before, structured, confident, meant to establish authority. But the supervisor did not look at him right away, did not respond immediately, and that delay stretched just long enough to make it noticeable. Just long enough to make Keller feel the absence of validation where he expected it most. And when the man finally turned his head, his eyes met Keller's with a calm that felt heavier than any raised voice ever could. "Officer Keller," he said evenly, "remove the cuffs." And for a moment Keller did not move, not because he did not hear the command, but because his mind struggled to align it with the reality he had constructed just minutes earlier. Because orders like that did not come without explanation, not in front of a crowd, not in situations like this. And he felt the eyes of everyone in the pharmacy settle on him, waiting, watching, measuring his response. And that pressure pushed against his hesitation until it broke, his hands moving almost automatically as he reached forward, unlocking the metal with a small, sharp click that echoed once again through the room. Only this time it did not sound like control, it sounded like release. And Margaret did not react dramatically, did not pull away or make a scene. She simply lowered her hands gently, rubbing her wrist for a brief second before letting them rest at her sides, her composure unchanged, her presence now even more grounded than before, as if the situation had simply caught up to her rather than the other way around. And Keller stepped back half a pace, the shift so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for everything else that had changed. And the supervisor turned slightly, addressing the room now, but still keeping his tone controlled. "There has been a procedural error," he said, and those words were carefully chosen, neutral. on the surface, but beneath them was something far more serious, something that did not need to be explained out loud for everyone to feel it. And Keller opened his mouth as if to respond, to clarify, to reclaim some part of the situation, but before he could form the words, Margaret spoke again, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time with something that was not anger, not satisfaction, but clarity. "You made a decision before you asked a question," she said, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than any accusation, because it was true, undeniably true, and there was no procedure, no report, no explanation that could undo that single moment where assumption had replaced judgment, and Keller felt it settle in, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow realization that the outcome he had expected was no longer possible, because this was no longer about what he thought had happened. It was about what had already been revealed. The silence that followed her words did not break right away. It stretched, settled, and wrapped itself around everyone in the room like something heavier than sound. And Officer Ryan Keller felt it pressing against him from all sides. Not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, because there was no argument he could reach for, no quick explanation that could restore what had just been lost. And for the first time since he had stepped into the pharmacy, his thoughts did not move ahead of the moment. They stayed in it, caught in the exact point where everything had shifted, and he glanced briefly at the supervisor as if searching for direction, for a signal that this could still be managed, still contained, but the man's expression did not offer that. It remained steady, controlled, and distant in a way that made it clear this was no longer a situation being handled in the usual way. This was being observed, documented, and understood on a different level entirely, and that realization settled into Keller slowly, like a weight he could not shake off, while Margaret Johnson stood quietly, her posture unchanged, her presence now filling the space in a way that required no effort at all, and she did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the whispers that had begun to ripple again, softer this time, more uncertain, because people were no longer watching a confrontation. They were watching a correction, something being reversed in real time, and that shift carried a different kind of tension, one that did not need raised voices or sudden movement to be felt, and the supervisor took a small step forward, his attention now fully on Keller. "Officer, step aside," he said, his tone even, not harsh, not raised, but final in a way that left no room for interpretation, and Keller hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, before complying, moving half a step back, then another, creating a space that had not existed before, a space where he was no longer at the center, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to unsettle him further. And the supervisor reached into his jacket, pulling out a small tablet, the screen lighting up with a soft glow that reflected faintly against his face as he tapped once, then turned it slightly toward Margaret. "Ma'am, can you confirm your identification?" he asked, and she nodded gently, reaching into her bag with slow, deliberate movement, not because she needed to prove anything, but because the process itself required it, and she handed over a slim card, simple in appearance, unremarkable at first glance, but the moment the supervisor looked at it, something shifted again, not visibly dramatic, but precise, controlled, the kind of recognition that happens instantly and changes everything without needing explanation, and Keller watched that moment unfold, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to understand what he was seeing, because nothing about this matched the expectation he had built from the start, and the supervisor straightened just slightly before handing the card back with both hands, a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. And then he spoke, not loudly, not for the crowd, but clearly enough that Keller could hear every word. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience." And that word, inconvenience, carried more weight than it should have, because it was not just a description, it was an acknowledgement, a correction, a quiet admission that something had gone wrong at a level far beyond a simple misunderstanding, and Keller felt that word settle into him, heavier than any accusation, because it came from the system he represented, and it did not support him, it did not justify him, it stood apart from him, and Margaret accepted it with a small nod, not as victory, not as validation, but as something expected, something that had already been accounted for long before this moment. And then she turned her attention back to Keller, her expression calm, her voice steady. "The question you did not ask," she said. was the only one that mattered. And there was no anger in it, no edge, just clarity, the kind that leaves no room for denial. And Keller opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but the words did not come, because he understood now, not fully, not all at once, but enough to know that whatever this situation had been when it started, it was no longer his to define. And in that realization, something else began to surface, something quieter but far more lasting. The understanding that this moment would not end when the room cleared. It would follow him, recorded not just in reports or statements, but in the space between what he assumed and what he failed to see. And that space, once exposed, could not be closed again. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not, because once something invisible becomes visible, it changes the way everything else is seen. And Officer Ryan Keller stood there feeling that shift settle deeper into him. No longer just a moment of uncertainty, but something more permanent. Something that lingered in the way people no longer looked at him the same. Not with fear, not with automatic trust, but with a quiet distance, as if they were recalculating what they had just witnessed, and he felt it in the space between their silence and his presence, a space that used to belong to authority, but now felt occupied by doubt. And the supervisor tapped once more on the tablet before lowering it slightly. His attention still measured, still controlled, but now clearly focused on process rather than assumption. "Officer Keller," he said, his voice steady, "I need you to walk me through your initial assessment." And the question itself was not unusual, but the way it was asked was, because it was no longer a formality, it was an evaluation, and Keller swallowed slightly before responding, his voice slower now, more deliberate. The clerk reported suspicious behavior, possible prescription fraud. I approached and detained for further investigation. He spoke the words carefully, aware now that each one carried weight beyond the moment, that each detail would be examined, not just for accuracy but for intent. And as he spoke, he could hear it himself. The gaps, the missing steps, the question that had never been asked, and the supervisor listened without interruption, without expression, until Keller finished, and then there was another pause, not long, but enough to make it clear that what came next mattered more than what had already been said. "Did you verify the prescription before detaining her?" the supervisor asked, and the simplicity of the question landed harder than anything else, because it went straight to the center of the situation, not around it, not through procedure, but directly to the point Keller had bypassed. And for a moment he did not answer, not because he did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he could not undo. And that hesitation was answer enough, the silence filling in the space where the truth sat unspoken, and Margaret watched quietly, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the same calm clarity she had carried from the beginning, because she already knew how this would unfold, not in detail, not in exact sequence, but in direction, because systems respond in patterns, and once a certain line is crossed, the outcome begins to write itself. And Keller finally spoke, his voice lower now. "No." And that single word seemed to settle into the room like a final piece of something that had been building since the moment he walked in. And the supervisor nodded once, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that the situation had moved from assumption to confirmation, and he turned slightly, addressing the space around them without raising his voice. "This will be documented," he said, and those words were not directed at anyone in particular, but everyone understood them, because documentation meant review, review meant accountability, and accountability meant consequence, not immediate, not loud, but inevitable. And Keller felt that word echo in his mind. Consequence, not as punishment, but as result, the natural outcome of a decision made too quickly, too confidently, without the question that should have come first. And he looked at Margaret again, this time not as a suspect, not as a subject, but as a person he had misjudged. And in that shift there was no comfort, only clarity, and she met his gaze without resistance, without hostility, just steady. And then she spoke once more, her voice quiet but unmistakable. "Authority is not proven by what you can do," she said. "It is proven by what you choose not to do." And the words did not accuse, they did not demand, they simply existed, leaving him with nothing to push against, nothing to deny, because the truth in them was already evident in everything that had just happened. And as the supervisor stepped slightly to the side, already preparing the next steps in a process that would move beyond this room, beyond this moment, Keller realized that the situation had not ended. It had only shifted from something immediate and visible to something slower, deeper, and far more lasting. Something that would follow him long after the pharmacy returned to its quiet routine, long after the people left and the lights dimmed, because some consequences do not arrive all at once. They unfold, step by step, just like the decision that caused them. The word consequence did not fade after it was spoken. It settled, lingering in the air like something unfinished, something still in motion, and Officer Ryan Keller could feel it unfolding in real time, not through raised voices or sudden actions, but through the quiet, methodical shift of control that had already begun to move beyond him. And he stood there, no longer at the center, no longer directing the outcome, just present as the process continued without his influence. And that was the part that felt unfamiliar. The loss was not loud. It was quiet, procedural, and absolute. And the supervisor turned slightly again, tapping once more on the tablet before speaking into his own radio, his tone calm but precise. Initiate internal review flag, code 714 confirmed. And the words carried a weight that Keller recognized now, not from experience, but from understanding what they meant, because code 714 was not just a signal. It was a trigger, something that moved the situation beyond immediate supervision into a higher level of scrutiny, one that did not rely on personal judgment or explanation, but on records, timelines, and facts that could not be adjusted once they were set in motion. And Keller felt a subtle tightening in his chest as he listened, because there was no longer a version of this where he could simply explain and move forward. This would be examined, step by step, and everything he had done, everything he had not done, would be placed under that same steady light that now filled the room. And around them the pharmacy remained quiet. But it was no longer the same quiet as before. It was aware now, attentive, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that extended beyond this space, something that would continue long after they left. And Margaret Johnson adjusted her cardigan slightly, a small, ordinary movement that contrasted with the weight of everything else. And she turned just enough to face the supervisor fully, her voice still calm, still measured. That will not be necessary beyond documentation, she said. And the supervisor paused for a moment, not out of confusion, but consideration, because her words carried authority of their own, not loud, not declared, but understood. And he nodded once, acknowledging the statement without questioning it, because some authority does not need to be explained, it is recognized. And Keller watched that exchange carefully, his mind working to connect the pieces that had not been clear before, because this was no longer just about a mistaken arrest, it was about position, about access, about a level of influence he had not seen coming, and the realization settled deeper with each passing second, that the woman he had approached without a question was someone whose presence alone had triggered a system response far beyond his reach, and that understanding did not arrive to understand before, that once authority is questioned in front of others it does not return in the same form. It does not reset, it changes shape, and sometimes it does not come back at all, and he adjusted his stance again, not to assert control this time, but simply to steady himself, because the structure he had relied on just minutes earlier no longer felt solid beneath him. And Margaret Johnson reached for her bag, lifting it with calm, unhurried movement, the kind that belonged to someone who had never lost control of the situation to begin with. And she turned slightly toward the counter, not to leave immediately, but to complete what she had come there to do. Because for her this moment was not an interruption, it was part of a larger pattern she had likely seen before, and the clerk stepped forward hesitantly, her voice softer now, uncertain. "Ma'am, your prescription is ready." And the words sounded different this time, stripped of the earlier suspicion, replaced with something closer to respect, and Margaret nodded gently, accepting the small paper bag that had been set aside earlier, the very item that had triggered everything, and she held it lightly in her hand, not as evidence, not as proof, but simply as what it had always been, a routine necessity, something ordinary that had been turned into something else by a decision made too quickly. And Keller watched that exchange, the simplicity of it standing in contrast to the weight of everything that had unfolded. And it struck him then, not suddenly but clearly, that the situation had never required force, never required urgency. It had required one thing, a question, and the absence of that question had changed everything. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment before lifting again, because now there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to control, only something to understand. And the supervisor stepped closer once more, his tone returning to procedural calm. "Officer Keller, you will report back to the station for follow-up," he said, and the instruction was simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation, and Keller nodded once, not out of habit, but because there was nothing else to do, the path forward no longer shaped by him, but already defined by what had been set in motion, and Margaret turned toward the exit. Then, her steps steady, unhurried, each movement carrying the same quiet certainty she had shown from the beginning. And as she reached the door, she paused for just a second, not to look back at the room, not to acknowledge the crowd, but to say one final thing, her voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach him without drawing attention from others. "The moment you stop seeing people clearly is the moment you stop doing your job." And then she stepped outside, the door closing behind her with the same soft chime as before, but this time it marked an ending rather than a beginning. And Keller remained where he was, the words settling into him in a way that could not be dismissed or rewritten, because they did not accuse him of what he had done, they revealed what he had failed to do. And in that difference was the lesson he could not ignore, because it was not about the report he would file or the review that would follow. It was about the space between assumption and understanding, a space he had crossed without noticing, and now that he had seen it, he knew it would not be invisible again. The pharmacy door had already closed behind Margaret Johnson, but the quiet she left behind did not disappear with her. It stayed, lingering in the space like something unfinished, something that would not simply fade with time. And Officer Ryan Keller stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was unsure of what to do next, but because for the first time he understood that what came next was not something he could rush, not something he could fix with a report or a statement, because this was no longer about procedure, it was about perception, and perception, once changed, does not return to what it was before. And he glanced briefly toward the glass door, where the outside world continued as if nothing had happened, cars passing, people walking, life moving forward without pause. And that contrast made the moment feel even more still, as if time inside the pharmacy had slowed just enough to force him to see what he had missed earlier. And the supervisor closed out the final note on the tablet, the soft tap of his finger marking the end of documentation but not the end of consequence. And he looked at Keller one last time, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet finality. "We will follow up at the station," he said, and Keller nodded again. The motion automatic, but the understanding behind it no longer routine, because he knew now that the follow-up would not be about the event alone. It would be about the decision, the moment where assumption replaced verification. And he turned slightly, preparing to leave, but his steps felt different, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with physical weight, and everything to do with awareness. And as he moved toward the exit, the same path Margaret had taken just moments earlier, he noticed something small, something he would not have paid attention to before, the way people looked at him, not directly, not confrontational, but observant, as if they were no longer seeing the uniform first, but the person inside it. And that shift, subtle as it was, carried more meaning than anything that had been said out loud. And he reached the door, pausing for just a fraction of a second before pushing it open, the familiar chime sounding again. But this time it did not mark the start of control, it marked the end of it. And as he stepped outside, the air felt different, not colder, not warmer, just clearer. And for the first time since the moment had begun, there was no noise, no voices, no instructions, just the quiet space of his own thoughts. And in that space, one truth remained, simple, undeniable, and impossible to ignore, that authority is not defined by the power to act, but by the discipline to understand before acting. And he stood there for a moment, the world moving around him, while that realization settled into something deeper, something lasting, because what had happened inside was not just an incident, it was a line, and once crossed, it does not disappear, it stays, shaping every step that follows. And as he finally began to walk, not with urgency, not with certainty, but with awareness. One thing was clear, the badge on his chest had not changed, but the meaning behind it had, and that was something no report could rewrite.